when you were editing this book or in your work as a philosopher, why do you think, and I think this is so interesting to think about, like, why do we as human beings get sucked into different types of conspiracies or conspiracy theories, and like how do we kind of stand stronger against that?
Yeah.
People ask me that all the time in my workshops and I don't have an answer, so maybe you can help me.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's an interesting and difficult question. I think there's someone mentioned this to me last night. I think it's a good point. In some ways, in our society, at least in the US, we're primed for this kind of thing. If you just think about all of the like mystery and spa, I mean, all the sort of entertainment things, you know, whether it's a, you know, prestige series on Netflix or movies, you know, sort of that we see this sort of stuff in a lot of our pop culture. But I think too, there's just this, and this is actually a good thing. Human beings, I think, as bearing God or being God's image in the world, we want to know what's true. So there's this, it's like a lot of things, this good ability and desire we have, but it can go astray. And so that maybe we're overly curious in a certain way, or we want to kind of be in the know. And so rather than just, we want an explanation, right? We want to like figure things out. And so I think, you know, from what I can gather from psychologists talking about these kind of things, like when we have this sense of fear or chaos in our society, as the the book title talks about, right? That there's one natural human response is just, we want to like gain control and understanding and figure it out. And so conspiracy theories, these like grand conspiracies like QAnon that are pretty demonstrably false, but they offer like a framework of understanding and knowing, and like, I know what's going on really, right? I can see behind the appearances to what's really going on. So that feels good. But in some ways, and look, none of us are perfect in this. It can be, I think, a failure of humility in a sense that we don't really accept our limits as much. And so I think my advice is often is, look, we're human, so we're fallible. We're fallible as knowers. If we want to think of, you know, what we can know and how we can acquire truth, God will guide us. But just because God will lead us into the truth, there's no promise that God's going to like tell me the truth about the 2020 election or about the Kennedy assassination. I mean, whatever it is, all the different things, because no human being can know all that stuff. And so I think if we kind of appreciate and accept our limits and just start suspending judgment more, right? Like, and that's another overlap with your book. You can see something online, and I've thought of times where I see something, and as you mentioned, this emotion of like, that's horrible, or that's awesome, and then I'm like, I want to like share or talk about it, and then I think, well, now wait a minute, how do I even know that's true? Just because there's this image or this I don't know this person, you know, from anyone, and blue checks on Twitter don't mean the same thing as they used to. So it's just kind of, yeah, it's a mess. So I think those are some of the things that play into it. And I think too, I'm trying to think like, why is it that maybe at least some Christians are more prone to this? I think in some ways, maybe we followed our culture. The culture in many ways is still pretty anti-intellectual, right? And I think we've kind of followed that on some parts of the church, where we just need to start doing the hard work of paying more attention to evidence. And publicly available evidence, not just secret stuff that someone, you know, says they know but can't really demonstrate.
Yeah, it's really good. I think that's another space where I think these two books go so well together, because I also talk about that idea of humility. Like, I just think people get so caught up in like sharing everything and getting like, I can do my own research on this, and I kind of want to say, like, sometimes we can't. Like during COVID, I'm not an epidemiologist. I have to trust that they are doing the science, you know, and that's okay.
Right.
And I think the online environment creates a space, like you were saying, where people want control, right? So they're going to do their own research, and then doing their own research isn't always that fruitful.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we think about, if these are some of the causes, how can we guard against it? Like, at least the conspiracy part, I think it's like any other aspect, at least from a Christian perspective, is being deeply embedded or involved in like a good community or good faith community. That can help, right? Growing, you know, I love this phrase from C.S. Lewis. He talks about the purpose of Christianity, I think he says, is for us to become, quote, little Christs, right? And so the idea there is cultivating, you know, the character of Christ, not just the moral virtues, but also the intellectual virtues, right? If you start looking at some of the ways Jesus engaged people, a lot of the intellectual virtues come up: creativity, compassion, and open-mindedness within proper bounds, those kind of things. Whether it's in, using resources like your book, my book, if it's relevant to somebody, but I think too, being willing to engage in conversation. So humility, I guess I'll close with this part of this, is that humility is not just a way to keep us from believing conspiracy theories that are false, but that's one good thing about it. But for someone like me, humility, intellectual and moral, who tends to be more skeptical about them. Is just because someone believes one, it doesn't mean that they are unintelligent. I think the data shows that that's not actually true. That highly educated people are just as likely to believe these. There are other things in play. So for me, it's the humility of, as a philosopher, here are the 3 reasons that that's not true. But it's more like, well, now why do you think that, right? And then trying to find common ground and building from there. That's probably the best way, both for myself, and I think what really is destructive about whether the fake news stuff and politics and the conspiracy theories is one of the things that the relationships are getting fractured, friendships, churches, even within families. I was on a call the other day where I was talking about his brother-in-law who started in QAnon, and he's gone like way down stuff that makes QAnon look just kind of normal. And so the relationship is basically gone right now. And so we want to do what we can to avoid that. If we have a family member or someone we love who's involved in this stuff, just kind of hitting them with arguments and, our views aren't going to work. It's got to be mutual, compassion, kind of a compassionate curiosity and some give and take.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's definitely what I'm seeing in the workshops that I offer to churches. A lot of times I feel like I can spend some time talking about practical tools and all of that. But at the end of the day, people want to know how to talk to their neighbors. And by neighbor, I just mean like the people in their lives. How do I love my neighbors? How do I have these hard conversations? And I think it's just it's hard because we're humans and relationships can be challenging. And to your point, I think it's saying, okay, how can we be more like Jesus in these conversations? And then that's where I know I hear a lot of people just saying, this is hard. And I think just normalizing that it's hard can be helpful for people too, just to say like, yeah, it is hard. You can find the truth of a situation or do some kind of fact checking, and that's great. But then like, it's the response that's the important part. And that's where our hearts are changed. And I've sort of described kind of what you're talking about, what I'm talking about as like discipleship work. If at the end of the day, we want people to be more like Jesus, it's all of these spaces, not just our physical space, but also our online information spaces. Like, how can we be more like Jesus? And it's discipleship work, and that's hard.